You found Scary Mary. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop and feel your breath slow down. Tonight's story is real and quiet, like the space between heartbeats. These are scary stories for brave dreams. Support the channel with a like, a comment, or a subscription. Your presence keeps the night alive. Close your eyes. The paper was his confession, his sanctuary, his game. It absorbed words just as it had once absorbed blood, greedily, completely. He formed the letters in an old-fashioned, ornate hand, a calligraphic cursive he had learned in the orphanage, where ink and pen were the only tools capable of giving any shape to the chaos of his thoughts. Every capital S resembled a writhing eel, every G a hangman's noose. On special days, he would sometimes mix his ink with his own urine or blood, drawn by jabbing needles into his withered thighs. This gave the text authenticity. This was how the soul, trapped within the body of a 70-year-old man, spoke to the world in its own secret language. His name was Albert Fish, but in the newspapers, the very ones he so loved to collect, he was known by other names: the Brooklyn Boogeyman, the Wisteria Vampire, the Moonlight Murderer. He collected those clippings too, neatly cutting out articles about his crimes and pasting them into a thick album alongside photographs of unfamiliar children, begged from trusting parents, and faded postcards of biblical scenes of sacrifice. Abraham raising the knife over Isaac was his favorite image. He saw in it not horror, but the highest form of love, the willingness to sacrifice the innocent at the command of a voice from above. Now, in December 1934, he sat in his cramped Manhattan room, in a house full of other lonely old men like himself, cast aside by life. The room was squalid, an iron bed with a thin mattress, a rickety chair, a washstand with a cracked ceramic bowl. But on the table, buried in papers, his own meticulously constructed chaos reigned. Outside, snow swirled, muffling the sounds of the city, turning New York into a giant, silent tomb. He was dressed in a worn but clean suit, and beneath it, on a body scarred and marked by needles, he wore his secret armor, a shirt of rough sackcloth, rubbed with onion and mustard. It was a punishment for sins not yet committed, but already festering in his brain like maggots in a ripe apple. The pain from the fabric chafing his old wounds was an anchor, holding him to reality when the voices in his head grew too loud. He took a fresh sheet of paper. He was going to write a letter, not an anonymous note, not a threat, but a confession. A letter to the mother of the girl he had killed, eaten, and been unable to forget. Her name was Grace Budd, and ever since, 6 years ago, he had lured her away under the guise of an employer promising a party, and strangled her in an empty house in Wisteria. He could not get her out of his head. She was his greatest secret and his most terrible pain. Her image, a small, fragile girl with a large white bow in her hair, had become an obsession around which all his thoughts revolved. He dipped his pen into the inkwell. The ink was ordinary violet. Today, he didn't need blood. The pain was of a different kind, aching, melancholy, demanding an outlet. My dear Mrs. Budd, he began to write with the deference of a widower penning a love letter. You will forgive me for writing to you, but in my lonely old age, my thoughts constantly return to my sins. And as the pen scratched across the paper, his mind, like a film reel, played back the scenes of a long, twisted, and monstrous life. He traveled into the past, into the labyrinths of memory, where his father's shadow was longer than the house itself, and the voice of God sounded not from the heavens, but from the darkest corners of his own soul. He was writing a letter, but in truth, he was writing his autobiography. The story of how a boy named Hamilton became a monster named Albert. Washington, 1870. He was born into a family that revered its ancestors and made plans for the future. His father, Randall Fish, was a riverboat captain on the Potomac. The house smelled of tobacco, leather, and river water, but this scent of paradise was short-lived. When Hamilton, he would take the name Albert later, was 5, his father died of a heart attack. Death entered his life quietly, a silent shadow, and remained there forever. His mother, Ellen Fish, could not cope with the grief and the burden of 4 children. Her piety, already bordering on fanaticism, turned into unbearable hysteria. She saw omens in every crack in the ceiling, heard the voice of the Lord in the creaking floorboards. She was sure the end of the world was near, and that her children, especially the youngest, Hamilton, were born in sin. To atone for this sin, they had to be chastened by fasting, by prayer, by the rod. But even the rod and constant prayer were not enough. There was no money. And in 1875, young Hamilton was sent to the St. John's Orphanage, a place that would become his first and most brutal purgatory. The orphanage was a huge, cold building of gray stone. It smelled not of food or childhood, but of lye, carbolic acid, and misery. The first thing he felt crossing the threshold was fear. The second was hunger. The oatmeal was watery and tasteless, the bread stale and moldy. But physical hunger was nothing compared to the hunger of the soul. No one hugged the children here. No one stroked their heads. Affection was considered a sin, an indulgence of the flesh. He was teased immediately for his surname Fish. "Hey, Fish, can you swim?" they yelled after him. He was a quiet, withdrawn boy with large, overly attentive eyes. He didn't know how to fight back, how to shout. He would just freeze, like a rabbit before a boa constrictor, and this only excited the predators. The beatings became routine. He was beaten in the dormitory, in the toilet, around the corner of the building. But one night, something different happened. He was awakened by a rough shove. Two older boys stood over his bed, their faces barely visible in the gloom. "Get up, Fishy," one of them hissed. "Let's go." He tried to resist, but they dragged him by force from the dormitory, down a cold corridor, into a storage room where mops and buckets were kept. The air was thick with the smell of dust and damp wood. "Take your clothes off," ordered the second. He cried, begged, but was struck in the face. The pain made his vision darken. With trembling hands, he began to pull off the coarse canvas shirt. What happened next forever divided his life into before and after. The pain was unfamiliar, piercing, tearing. It came from the very center of his body, from a place he was ashamed to even think about. He screamed, but a hand was clamped over his mouth. He saw faces above him, twisted with a pleasure he couldn't understand. He felt like a piece of meat, an object. In that moment, something important happened to him. His consciousness, unable to bear the horror of what was happening, detached from his body. He suddenly saw everything from the outside. A small, skinny boy on the dirty floor, and two older teenagers doing something unspeakable to him. He was a spectator. That body down there was no longer his. It was just a shell, a doll being tortured. The real him was floating near the ceiling, safe behind a thick glass wall. This mechanism of dissociation became his primary defense. He would use it again and again during his crimes, during his self-flagellation, to retreat into himself, to become an observer. But there was another, more terrible transformation. At the peak of the pain, at the moment of the most unbearable humiliation, he suddenly felt a strange, perverse pleasure. It was vile, sinful, but it was there. A wave of warmth, mixed with pain, ran through his body. His brain, trying to cope with the trauma, linked pain with pleasure, humiliation with ecstasy. From then on, the nocturnal visits became regular. Sometimes they took him alone, sometimes in turn with others. He stopped resisting. He learned to retreat into himself, waiting out the nightmare. And then, alone in his bed, he would analyze these sensations. The pain and shame were inextricably linked with that vague, dirty pleasure. He began to seek that connection on his own. One night, seizing a moment, he stole several needles from the sewing class. He hid them under his mattress, and when everyone was asleep, trembling with fear and anticipation, he stuck one of them into his thigh, near his groin. The sharp, burning pain made him flinch, but with the pain came relief. It was his choice, his control over the pain. Through this self-inflicted pain, he atoned for the shame he felt after the assaults. He was purifying himself. The needle became his sacred instrument, his key to salvation. His only refuge was religion. He immersed himself in it with a fanaticism that astonished even the orphanage priests. He memorized entire chapters of the Bible, especially from the Old Testament. He was fascinated by stories of God's wrath, of Sodom and Gomorrah, of the sacrifice of Isaac. He saw in Abraham not a tyrant, but a saint, willing to make an absolute sacrifice in the name of faith. God commanded, and Abraham obeyed. In this was the highest truth. It was then that he began to hear voices, at first quiet, like a whisper in the next room, then louder. Sometimes it was the voice of God, praising him for his endurance and ordering him to suffer further. Sometimes the voices of angels, singing wondrous songs to him, and sometimes, on the darkest nights, the Lord himself came to him in the form of a pillar of fire that filled the entire room, and said that to save the world, to atone for the sins of mankind, blood was needed, not the blood of a lamb, but the blood of the innocent, the blood of a child. These thoughts frightened him. He prayed harder, stuck more needles into himself, sometimes fasted for several days. But the voices did not cease. They became a part of him, like the beating of his heart. They were his secret friends and tormentors. When he turned 16, he ran away from the orphanage. He walked out the gates a skinny, lanky youth with a shifty gaze and a quiet voice. His soul was broken, and demons lived in his head. Demons he had learned to feed with pain and fear. He was ready to carry this internal hell into the big world. The next 40 years of his life were a time of wandering, turmoil, and a slow, steady descent into absolute darkness. He became Albert Fish. Under that name, he felt more confident. He was a hard-working and undemanding laborer, a painter, a carpenter, a janitor. He drifted all over the country, from New York to Texas, from Florida to Connecticut. He was a ghost, a shadow, leaving no traces. He married. He met a young woman who seemed kind and calm to him. They had 6 children. From the outside, it might have looked like a normal life. He came home from work, had dinner, sometimes played with the children, read them bedtime stories. But his family did not know about the demons dancing in his head. They didn't see how at night he would go to the shed and torture himself for hours with a whip studded with nails. They didn't hear the voices whispering to him about blood and flesh. His wife eventually could not bear his strange melancholies, his sudden withdrawals and trances. She left, taking the children. He did not try to stop her. Perhaps he was afraid himself of what he might do to them. The voices grew more insistent. The image of the pillar of fire appeared to him more and more often. Left alone, he finally surrendered to his demons. The fantasies he had suppressed all these years broke free. They were vivid, tangible. He saw himself cutting meat, not pork or beef, but human flesh. He imagined what it tasted like, tender, juicy, pure. His reading of the Bible shifted focus to the passages that spoke of cannibalism during sieges. He saw in this not an act of desperation, but a kind of sacred ritual. The flesh of the innocent was a holy sacrament, a path to unity with God. He began to hunt. His victims were those society wouldn't miss: drifters, prostitutes, homeless children, black boy laborers. He was not strong, but he was cunning and infinitely patient. He pretended to be a good-natured, eccentric old man, offering food, money, work. He knew how to gain the trust of lonely mothers, eager to help their child. He developed a whole ritual. He called it the preparation. Before each murder, he fasted and prayed, preparing himself for the sacred act. He would take out his toolkit, a worn leather case containing knives of various sizes, a saw, ropes, whips. He cleaned and sharpened them meticulously. These were his sacred vessels. The first murders were clumsy, full of fear and self-disgust. But with each time, his hand grew steadier and his mind colder. He learned to derive not only physiological, but spiritual satisfaction from it. The act of killing itself was for him the climax, the moment of highest ecstasy, when the victim's pain and his own pleasure merged into one, and the subsequent consumption of the flesh was an act of absolute possession. He was consuming not just meat, he was consuming the soul, the innocence, the very life of his victim. He believed that in this way he was cleansing them of the sins of this world and sending them straight to God, and their strength passed to him. After each act, he would pray again, asking for forgiveness, and punish himself by sticking needles deeper and deeper into his body. He lived in an eternal cycle: sin, atonement, sin. His body became a map of his crimes. Every scar, every embedded shard of a needle was a monument to one of his victims. He became the ghost, the boogeyman, whispered about in the newspapers. He changed names, cities, jobs. He could be anyone. The real him lived only in the moments when he heard the crunch of bone, felt the warm, salty taste of blood, and saw the last, fading fear in his victim's eyes. In those moments, all the voices in his head fell silent, and a blissful, deafening silence descended. But one day he met a victim who changed everything. One who would not leave his memory. Her name was Grace Budd. The advertisement in the newspaper was small, inconspicuous. Young girl seeks work as a maid or servant. Grace Budd, 12 years old. He was 58, but on the telephone, his voice sounded young, brisk, and noble. He introduced himself as Mr. Frank Howard, a wealthy farmer from Long Island, and said he was looking for a servant for his wife for an upcoming party. Pay $15 a week, an unheard of sum for a girl from a poor family at the time. When he came to the Budds' apartment in Manhattan, he was struck by the atmosphere of simple, poor, but honest life. He himself had come from such a background, and this both attracted and irritated him. He hated that poverty, that grayness, but at the same time he was drawn to it as to an unattainable ideal of purity. He spoke with Mrs. Budd, Delia, politely, almost obsequiously. He was dressed in his best, the worn suit. He talked about his farm, his invalid wife, the upcoming holiday. He was the epitome of respectability and decency. Grace came out of the adjoining room. She was small, thin, with large, naive eyes. In her dark hair was a large white bow, which she had apparently put on specially for the guest's arrival. She looked at him with timid curiosity and hope. "Here she is, our Gracie," said Mrs. Budd, looking at her daughter with pride. Fish smiled his most harmless smile. "A charming girl," he said. "Exactly the kind of modest and hardworking helper we are looking for. There will be many other children at the party, treats, music. It will be a real holiday for her." He saw Grace's eyes light up. She dreamed of an adventure, an escape from the gray walls of her apartment. Her mother looked at him with a slight, barely perceptible anxiety, but trusted the respectable-looking old man. How she would later torment herself for that trust, for that one single mistake that would shatter her life. They agreed that he would pick up Grace the following Saturday. He kissed Mrs. Budd's hand, bowed, and left. His heart was beating fast. The hunt had begun. Saturday, May 25, 1928. He came for Grace exactly at the appointed time. The girl was ready in her best dress and that same white bow. She was beaming with excitement. "You'll be a good girl and obey Mr. Howard, won't you?" Delia Budd instructed her, straightening the collar of her dress. "Of course, Mama," replied Grace. Fish stood in the doorway and smiled. Inside, everything was screaming. The voices were exulting. The pillar of fire danced in his mind. God whispered, "Lead her. She is yours." He led Grace to the station. He bought 2 tickets, but not to Long Island, but to Wisteria, a small town where he had scouted out a deserted house. He knew this place. It was perfect, secluded, empty, silent. On the way on the train, he was courteous and fatherly. He bought her a box of candy, told funny stories about life on the farm, about animals. He watched as she smiled trustingly. Her cheeks flushed with excitement, and felt the familiar wave of arousal rising within him, mixed with cold, calculated horror. He already saw her undressed. He already tasted her flesh. He dissociated, observing the scene from the outside. A kind old man and a happy girl in the window of a train speeding towards its doom. In Wisteria, they got off at a small, almost deserted station. It was cool. A light breeze was blowing. "Where is your farm, Mr. Howard?" asked Grace, looking around. There were only sparse houses and fields. "Not far, child," he replied, still maintaining the noble tone. "We have to walk a little. My wife sent a carriage for us, but it seems to be delayed." "No matter, we'll walk." He led her down a dusty road that led into the woods. The conversation gradually died down. Grace grew anxious. She walked beside him, but no longer looked around with interest, only glancing at her companion furtively. Her instincts, though childish, began to sound alarms. They approached a 2-story house with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. It stood away from the road, surrounded by overgrown weeds. The place was deserted and silent. Not even birds sang. "Where is the party, Mr. Howard?" asked Grace, and for the first time, pure, genuine fear sounded in her voice. Fish stopped at the door. He turned to her, and at that moment his face changed. The mask of the kind old man slipped away. His features sharpened. His gaze became empty and heavy, like lead. "Inside, child," he replied, and his voice became flat, metallic, devoid of all emotion. "The party is inside." He took out a key. He had picked the lock beforehand and unlocked the door. It creaked open, releasing a wave of musty, deathly air. Inside was semi-darkness. In the large, empty hall lay fragments of furniture. Scraps of wallpaper hung from the walls like skin from a leper. Grace froze on the threshold. "I don't want to go in there," she whispered. He grabbed her by the hand. His grip was iron. "You will go in," he said. He dragged her inside and slammed the door shut. The click of the lock sounded like a gunshot. Now they were alone in this coffin. Light filtered through the cracks in the shutters, drawing stripes on the dusty floor like prison bars. He turned to her. She stood, clutching her purse to her chest, looking at him with huge, tear-filled eyes. Her body trembled. "Please, Mr. Howard, let me go," she pleaded. "I want my mother." "Take your clothes off," he said. She began to cry. Quiet, pitiful sobs shook her small body. He stepped towards her and struck her face, not hard, but enough for her to understand the game was over. The pretense of the kind uncle was over. Reality had begun. "I said, take them off," he growled. Sobbing, she began to unbutton her dress. Her hands trembled. The buttons wouldn't give. Finally, She pulled the dress over her head and stood in a simple cotton slip and panties. She tried to cover herself with her arms to shrink, to become smaller. And then it overwhelmed him, the sight of her fragile, childish body, her absolute animal terror, her tears, all merged into one, and evoked a storm of emotions in him that he could not control. It was not just a thirst for murder. It was a need for absolute possession, for consumption, for the destruction of this innocence that burned him so from within. The pillar of fire in his head roared, demanding a sacrifice. He lunged at her. He strangled her, pressing his bony, aged palm over her small mouth and nose. She resisted, beat him with her weak little hands, scratched his face. Her eyes, full of silent horror and incomprehension, looked at him. He saw the light slowly fading in them. As life left this fragile vessel, her body went limp. He released her, and she collapsed lifelessly onto the dusty floor. For a few seconds, there was silence, broken only by his heavy breathing. Then the ritual began. He stripped her completely. He took a knife from his toolkit, sharp as a razor with a narrow blade. He didn't just kill her. He performed a sacred rite over her. He dismembered the body with almost surgical precision, acquired over many years of practice. He severed the head with that same white bow that had bounced so cheerfully on the train. He cut off the arms, the legs. He slit open the chest and removed the internal organs. Then he cut the carcass into smaller pieces: thighs, shoulders, breast meat. He lit a fire in the fireplace, using fragments of old furniture. He had brought a pot and a frying pan with him. He cooked. He boiled and fried the meat of Grace Budd. He ate it for several days, never leaving the deserted house. He felt her flesh becoming a part of him, her innocence penetrating his defiled soul. He prayed over each piece, thanking God for the sacrifice granted to him. In those moments, he felt like Abraham, sacrificing the lamb. He was both the priest and the executioner and the congregation. When he was finished, he gathered the remains, bones, guts, internal organs, what he couldn't or didn't want to eat, and wrapped them in old newspapers. He buried this bundle in the woods nearby, under the roots of an old oak tree. Her dress, slip, panties, and that same white bow. He burned in the fireplace, watching as the fabric flared up and turned to ash. Then he took the train back to New York. He became once again the quiet, inconspicuous old man renting a room in a poor neighborhood. But something inside him had finally broken. Grace Budd did not leave. Her image, her last look, haunted him. He cut out all the newspaper articles about her disappearance. He followed the grief of the Budd family with a morbid, sadistic interest. He became obsessed with her, She was his most perfect victim, his masterpiece. And now, 6 years later, this obsession, mixed with a desire to be caught, poured out onto paper. The letter to Mrs. Budd was long, detailed, and openly sadistic. He described everything: how he had lured Grace, how he killed her, how he dismembered her, how he cooked and ate her flesh. He wrote that it was the most delicious meat he had ever tasted. He enjoyed not only the memory, but also the pain these words would cause the mother. This was the final stage of his ritual, mocking the grief, defiling the very memory. I did not have sexual intercourse with her, nor was there any violence as you understand it. The violence was of a different kind. I ate her flesh, and she became a part of me. Now, when I die, a part of Gracie will die with me. We are forever connected. Sometimes at night, I hear her crying. But it is not a cry of suffering. It is a cry of joy that she was chosen for such a high purpose. He did not sign the letter, but left a return address, a station on Lexington Avenue that gave out free food for the homeless. It was not a mistake. It was a challenge. It was part of the ritual. He wanted to be caught. His demons were tired of freedom. They craved the final act, the climax, the trial, and the execution. He wanted his suffering to become public, for the whole world to learn of his special relationship with God and pain. He neatly folded the letter, put it in an envelope, addressed it to Delia Budd, and dropped it in a mailbox. Then he returned to his little room, lay down on the bed, and began to wait. He was calm. The deed was done. Delia Budd, receiving the envelope with unfamiliar handwriting, at first thought it was some belated condolence, but as she began to read, she was plunged into a vortex of pure nightmare. With each line, a growing wave of horror, disgust, and disbelief washed over her. When she reached the description of how Mr. Howard had cooked her daughter's meat, she screamed and fainted. Coming to, she brought the letter, sobbing, to the police. The detectives, reading it, were shocked. Even seasoned investigators had never encountered such a level of blatant cruelty and cynicism. They immediately checked the return address. It was a real station on Lexington Avenue. They set up round-the-clock surveillance. Soon they noticed a skinny, stooped old man with tufts of gray hair and insane, faded blue eyes. He came there every day for a bowl of soup. He matched the description given by Mrs. Budd. On December 28, 1934, as he was leaving the station, 2 detectives approached him. "Sir, are you Albert Fish?" The old man stopped and looked at them with a calm, almost indifferent gaze. "Yes," he replied. "But you are probably looking for the man who killed Grace Budd." "That was I." He was arrested and placed in the Tombs prison. He was calm and even cheerful. At last, he was the center of attention. Psychiatrists, investigators, journalists, all wanted to look into the abyss of his soul. And he let them. He talked. In detail, savoring the particulars, he described not only the murder of Grace Budd, but his other crimes as well. He confessed to 6 murders, but hinted there were more, maybe 100, maybe more. He said he ate his victims because he loved children. They were tender and juicy, like suckling pigs. The psychiatrists were stunned. They diagnosed him with sadism, masochism, cannibalism, hallucinations, paranoia, and sexual fetishism. They sent him for an X-ray, which revealed a shocking picture. 29 metal needles were embedded in the tissues of his pelvis and perineum, the result of years of self-mutilation. The X-ray looked like a ghastly treasure map, studded with metal splinters. He was proud of it. He showed the doctors his scars, told them how he drove needles into himself, ate his own excrement, drank urine, wore sackcloth rubbed with mustard. For him, this was proof of his chosen status, his special relationship with God. He was a holy martyr in his own perverted cult. The trial of Albert Fish, which began in March 1935, became a circus. The public flocked to the hearings to see the Brooklyn boogeyman. He sat in the defendant's dock, straight and imperturbable, like a patriarch at a church service. He listened carefully to the charges, nodded, sometimes made notes in a notepad with his calligraphic handwriting. The prosecution insisted on the death penalty. The defense tried to prove his insanity. The lawyers brought in psychiatrists who spoke of his madness, the voices, the hallucinations, the horrific childhood. But the main evidence against him was himself. When he was called to the stand, he gave testimony that made the jurors and the public's blood run cold, calmly, methodically, without a hint of remorse. He described the murder of Grace Budd. He told how he cut her up, how he fried her meat in a pan with onions and carrots, how he made soup from her. Why, the prosecutor asked him, pale as a sheet, barely holding back nausea. For God's sake, why did you do it? Fish looked at him with his faded blue eyes, in which absolute, bottomless madness swirled, concealed by a mask of sanity. I had a mania, he replied simply, as if explaining why he preferred tea to coffee. A desire, the desire to torture and eat children. I could not resist it. It was stronger than me. I had to do it. It was the voice of God. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. On his last day, he was unusually calm and even cheerful. He asked for a hearty meal for dinner, a large, rare steak, fried chicken with mashed potatoes, several slices of white bread, coffee, and donuts. He ate with with a voracious appetite, complimenting the prison cook. "Excellent steak," he remarked to the warden, "though, of course, it can't compare to the meat of a child. That is more tender." The warden, turning pale, walked away from his cell. Before the execution, he wrote a final letter to his ex-wife. In it, he apologized for all the trouble he had caused and thanked her for giving him such wonderful children. He wrote of his feelings for them, gave practical advice. The letter was filled with such sincere, almost touching concern that the prison chaplain who read it could not believe it was written by the same man who had butchered and eaten little Grace Budd. It was the last and most eerie mask of Albert Fish. At 2306, he was led down the corridor to the death chamber. He walked briskly, without the help of the guards, his aged legs carrying him firmly and confidently. He entered the room with the electric chair, a massive wooden chair with straps by himself. He sat down on it and allowed himself to be strapped in at the chest, arms, and legs as the copper helmet with the electrode was placed on his shaved head, and a second electrode was attached to his shin. He smiled at his executioner, John Hulping, and said in his quiet, creaky voice, "This will be the supreme thrill of my life. I am looking forward to meeting the Lord." His last words, addressed to the witnesses of the execution, were, "I don't know why I am here. I am not guilty. I didn't kill anyone." It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. But it was also his personal truth. He truly did not understand his guilt from the perspective of the ordinary world. He lived by his own laws, in his own perverted moral universe, where pain was prayer, murder was communion, and cannibalism was an act of holy love. The lever was thrown. A current of 2,000 volts struck his body. It shook in violent convulsions. Steam poured from his mouth. The smell of burnt meat and ozone filled the air. Legend has it that the old, fragile chair could not withstand the monstrous voltage and nearly broke under him. As if death itself resisted, unwilling to embrace such a soul. The doctor pronounced him dead. Albert Fish was 65 years old. Epilogue. The lingering shadow Albert Fish died, but his story did not. It became part of American folklore, its darkest chapter. Psychiatrists and criminologists studied his case for decades, trying to understand the nature of evil that seemed to have no logical explanation. He was not a classic lone monster. He was a man with his childhood pain, his fears, his mutilated faith. He was a product of a cruel childhood, severe mental illness, and that dark, incomprehensible cocktail of religion and sadomasochism that he had brewed for himself. He proved that the most terrifying story is not about a ghost or a vampire. The most terrifying story is about a man who lives next door, A quiet, polite, pious old man who comes to your house, smiles at your children, and then writes you a letter detailing how he ate your daughter. And the most horrible thing is that in every such letter, in every such story, there is a tiny, almost invisible crack through which each of us can peer. And if you look too long, you can see the reflection of the very abyss that swallowed Albert Fish, an abyss that is not outside, but inside human nature, and which sometimes, on the quietest nights, when the noise of the city fades and only the beating of your own heart remains, whispers to us our darkest, most secret fears. And this whisper sounds so familiar, as if it had always been a part of us, as if the monster is not the one who comes from outside, but the one who sleeps quietly within each of us, waiting for its hour. In 1890, a young Albert Fish, working as a painter in Delaware, meets a homeless boy named Thomas. Thomas disappears. In his diary, Fish would later write, "The boy was sick. I freed his soul. The taste was bitter, like wormwood." In 1891, a girl, the daughter of a prostitute, disappears in Atlantic City. The police attribute the disappearance to an accident. Fish was working in the city as a janitor at the time. A series of disappearances of homeless children in Harlem. Fish was renting a room in the same neighborhood. He would later confess that the city was full of sinners in need of cleansing. 1927, a year before the murder of Grace Budd, Fish writes the first of his prophetic letters to a newspaper, vaguely hinting at a great sacrifice that would bring the kingdom of heaven closer. The letter went unnoticed. 1930, after the murder of Grace, but before his arrest, Fish attempts to abduct another child in the Bronx, but is scared off by a passerby. In his diary, he interprets this as a sign from above. His mission was complete, and now he must wait. These episodes, like many others, were never proven. They remain in history as silent shadows, whispering that the true scale of the evil committed by Albert Fish may never be known. And this unknown is perhaps the most terrifying part of his story.